The moving truck hadn't even pulled away from my new house on Maple Ridge Court when I saw her marching across the street. Patricia Brennan, president of the Maple Ridge HOA, moved with the determination of someone who had just spotted a code violation from space. Her clipboard bounced against her hip with each aggressive step, and she was already shaking her head before she reached my driveway. "I need to document your moving vehicle," she announced without so much as a hello or welcome to the neighborhood. "The truck has been parked here for 47 minutes, and our bylaws clearly state that commercial vehicles cannot remain on residential property for more than 30 minutes. I watched her scribble furiously on her clipboard while the movers continued carrying boxes into my new home. This was my introduction to Patricia Brennan and the Maple Ridge Homeowners Association. My name is David Fletcher, and I had just purchased this 4-bedroom colonial after selling my property management company in the city. At 38 years old, I was looking forward to a quieter life managing my remaining commercial properties remotely. What I didn't expect was to become public enemy number one to an HOA president who apparently had nothing better to do than measure grass height with a ruler. The first official violation notice arrived the next morning, taped to my front door in a bright orange envelope. Improper placement of trash receptacles, it read, with a $50 fine attached. I had placed my bins at the curb 12 hours before the approved window. Patricia had helpfully included time-stamped photos she had taken at 11 p.m. the previous night. The second notice came that afternoon, citing me for unapproved exterior modifications because I had hung a bird feeder without submitting the proper architectural review form. By the end of my first week, I had accumulated $300 in fines and received a strongly worded letter about the unauthorized shade of white on my garage door trim. Patricia had actually brought paint swatches to compare against my house in broad daylight while I watched from my home office window. She spent 20 minutes holding different whites up to my trim and photographing each comparison with her phone. The HOA meetings were held every Tuesday at 7 p.m. in what they called the community center, but was really just a converted retail space in the small shopping plaza at the neighborhood entrance. I decided to attend my first meeting to address these ridiculous fines. Patricia sat at the head of a folding table, flanked by her 2 vice presidents who nodded at everything she said like synchronized bobbleheads. When I raised my hand during the open forum, she actually pretended not to see me for 5 full minutes before acknowledging my presence. "Mr. Fletcher," she said with obvious disdain, "you have not been a resident long enough to qualify for speaking privileges at our meetings. You need to demonstrate 90 days of compliance before earning that right." The other residents shifted uncomfortably in their metal chairs, but no one spoke up. I could see the fear in their eyes as Patricia's gaze swept across the room, daring anyone to challenge her authority. What Patricia didn't know was that I had spent the last 15 years in commercial real estate. I owned several properties throughout the state, including a small portfolio of retail spaces that I had kept as passive income investments. While organizing my files that weekend, I made an interesting discovery that made me laugh out loud in my home office. The lease agreement for Suite B in the Maple Ridge Shopping Center was right there in my filing cabinet. The tenant listed was the Maple Ridge Homeowners Association, and they had been renting from my company, Summit Property Holdings, LLC, for the past 8 years. The monthly rent was $2,500, and their lease was up for renewal in exactly 60 days. Patricia Brennan's signature was right there at the bottom of every annual renewal. I spent the next week documenting every single harassment tactic Patricia employed. She had her husband Carl drive by my house 6 times a day, taking photos. She measured my lawn with an actual ruler and left a note saying the grass was a 1/4 inch above regulation height. She even called the city to report that my home office might be violating residential zoning laws. Each incident was carefully recorded in my notebook along with dates, times, and witness names. The following Tuesday, I arrived at the HOA meeting 30 minutes early and waited in my car. I watched Patricia unlock the door to their office space, the same space they rented from me, though she had no idea. She turned on the lights, arranged her papers at the head table, and prepared for another evening of wielding her tiny amount of power over the neighborhood. What she didn't notice was the certified letter I had taped to the door exactly 29 minutes before the meeting began. The meeting started normally, with Patricia reading the minutes from last week and announcing new violations she had discovered. She was in the middle of proposing a new rule about mailbox decorations when her husband Carl walked in late, holding the envelope I had left. He whispered something in her ear, and her face went from confused to pale to bright red in the span of 10 seconds. She stood up so fast her chair fell backward with a crash that echoed through the room. "This is illegal," she shrieked, waving the paper in the air. "You cannot do this to us. We are the Homeowners Association. We have rights." I stood up calmly and smiled. "Actually, Patricia, as the owner of Summit Property Holdings, I absolutely can choose not to renew your lease. The 60-day notice I've provided exceeds the requirements stated in our agreement. Unless, of course, you'd like to discuss new terms." The room erupted in confused murmurs as residents tried to understand what was happening. Patricia's vice presidents looked at each other in panic while she stood there, opening and closing her mouth like a fish out of water. Someone asked what was going on, and I was happy to explain. "Your HOA president has been harassing me since the day I moved in. What she didn't know is that I own the building where your HOA office is located. The same office you're sitting in right now." Patricia tried to regain control, but her voice cracked as she spoke. "This is extortion. This is blackmail. I'll sue you for everything you have." I pulled out my phone and showed the room my documentation. "Actually, Patricia, I have evidence of you taking photos of my property at 11 p.m., measuring my grass with a ruler, and filing false reports with the city. That sounds more like harassment to me, but I'm willing to forget all of that if you'd like to negotiate a new lease at, let's say, triple the current rate." The room went silent, except for the humming of the fluorescent lights overhead. Patricia's face had turned an alarming shade of purple, and her hands were shaking as she gripped the edge of the table. "Triple," she whispered, like the word physically hurt her. "That's $30,000 a year for this tiny office." I shrugged and suggested she could always find a new location, though we both knew there were no other commercial spaces within 5 miles of the neighborhood. What happened next was better than I could have imagined. One of the residents, a quiet woman named Janet, who lived 3 houses down from me, suddenly stood up. I moved to call an emergency vote of no confidence in our current HOA president. The motion was seconded immediately by 4 different people. Patricia screamed that they couldn't do this, that she had built this HOA from nothing, that they were all ungrateful traitors. The vote was held right there. Despite Patricia's protests, 23 residents voted to remove her from the board. Only her husband, Carl, and her 2 vice presidents voted to keep her. The look on her face when the results were announced was priceless, a mixture of shock, rage, and complete disbelief. She stood there frozen as Janet was nominated and elected as the new president by unanimous vote, minus Patricia's family, of course. But the evening wasn't over yet. As the new president, Janet's first action was to void all the fines Patricia had issued in the last 30 days, pending review. The $300 in fines against me were dismissed immediately, along with dozens of other bogus violations Patricia had invented. Then Janet turned to me and asked if I would consider keeping the current lease terms for the HOA office if they promised to run things fairly. Patricia couldn't contain herself any longer. She grabbed the clipboard she had used to terrorize the neighborhood and threw it across the room, where it clattered against the wall. "You're all going to regret this," she screamed, pointing at everyone in the room. "I know things about all of you. I have documented everything, every single violation for years." Her husband tried to calm her down, but she shoved him away and continued her meltdown. That's when I revealed the final piece of information I had been saving. "Patricia," I said calmly, "you should know that using HOA resources for personal vendettas is actually a breach of fiduciary duty. The state takes that very seriously, especially when there's evidence of selective enforcement and harassment. I've already forwarded my documentation to an attorney who specializes in HOA law." Her face went from purple to white in an instant. She knew exactly what that meant. Board members who breach their fiduciary duty can be held personally liable for damages and legal fees. The attorney I had consulted estimated that the potential fines and legal costs could easily reach $50,000 or more. Patricia stumbled backward, knocking over a stack of violation notices she had prepared for the meeting. The room watched in stunned silence as Patricia Brennan, the terror of Maple Ridge, crumbled before their eyes. She mumbled something about needing her lawyer and stumbled toward the door, with Carl trailing behind her, still trying to understand what had just happened. As she reached the exit, she turned back one more time, her eyes filled with tears of rage and humiliation. 3 weeks later, Patricia was served with a lawsuit from 7 different homeowners for selective enforcement and harassment. The legal fees alone would cost her $35,000, and the judge ordered her to pay an additional $40,000 in damages to the affected residents. She stood in the courtroom as the judgment was read, her hands trembling and her face a mask of complete defeat.